Hello again. Last lecture was about melody and other related things. Today I'm going to talk about harmony. And as I so often do, I'm going to start by criticizing the book's definition of the term harmony. Now when I do this, again, don't worry so much about, let's say, how it might relate to a question on the test. Even this definition, which I'm about to quibble with, is the definition that I would use in a test, since it's there in the book. I'm not trying to trip anybody up, but I want to make us think a little bit about what harmony really is. And this definition in particular is problematic. It says here on page 40, harmony refers to the way chords are constructed and how they follow each other. Then it goes on to define what a chord is, and this is a correct definition of a chord. A chord is a combination of 3 or more tones sounded at once. So if we take those two definitions, I guess that would mean that you cannot have harmony without chords. But that isn't true, actually. So for example, if two people are singing and they are harmonizing with each other, like, I don't know, Simon and Garfunkel, if you've ever heard of them, there's only 2 of them singing, but they are singing in harmony. If 2 people are singing a duet, they are certainly harmonizing, even though they can each only sing 1 note at a time. So the definition of chord actually makes the definition of harmony that they give problematic. So my definition of harmony would be, harmony refers to the organization of simultaneous different tones. Any scheme by which you organize different tones that are happening at the same time, that's harmony, right? And it may not necessarily involve chords at all. In fact, as we will see when we go through music history, harmony in the West was not developed by people thinking up chords. Chords came along later. What we had were people singing melodic lines and then other people harmonizing with them. So we think of melodic lines as being sort of like horizontal lines. Okay, now remember, all of this is happening in time, not in space. But the way that we read it on a page and the way that we conceptualize it, since we are so much more visually oriented, we think of melodic lines as sort of like horizontal lines. The chords we think of as sort of like vertical structures, okay? But as those melodic lines coincide, let's say on any given point where we might have 2 or 3 or 4 notes, we might say, okay, there's a chord. But the way that it actually happened was, we had melodic lines being harmonized, usually some pre-existing melody that had been around for a long time. Some clever singer or musician harmonized, that is, had maybe another melodic line moving in parallel to it. And if we add enough of these, we might end up with something that we call a chord. But the melodies and the harmonization of melodies came first. Chords came much, much later. That is, the idea of a chord as a separate structure that could exist outside of a melody. That's something that comes along a bit later. So, just kind of keeping that in mind, but do use the definition in the book. Just maybe put a little asterisk next to it in your head. You do not need to have chords in order to have harmony. You do not need to have a minimum of 3 notes in order to have harmony. 2 different tones will do. You've got harmony there. So the organization of any simultaneously sounding different tones or pitches we could consider harmony. Okay, and then it says here, the next word in bold print, and again, I'm not going to just read from the book, I'm going to give you highlights. Progression. A progression is a logical sequence of chords. So generally, again, in Western music, if we are going to have harmony, which we don't necessarily have to have, right? If we have something in monophonic texture, by definition, there is no harmony in monophonic texture because you've got a single line of melody and nothing else, right? So a little review from the previous lecture. But if we do have harmony, and if we do have chords in our harmony, then usually we try, that is composers, musicians, try to use logical sequences of chords. Now, the fact that there are logical sequences of chords that we call chord progressions must mean that there exists the possibility of illogical sequences of chords, or maybe random sequences of chords. And this is true. And this is something that maybe people who have never taken a course in tonal harmony might not realize, and that is that people who are trained, who have studied harmony, or maybe even people who haven't necessarily studied or trained but have a good ear, a good natural talent or whatever, but certainly people who have trained and studied tonal harmony use chords, and again I'm using my analogies here, use chords sort of like maybe the way a trained mechanic uses tools, right? Certain tools have certain specific purposes. They do, and some tools do more than one thing well, but certain tools just don't function to do certain things. You need the right tool to do the job. And for a very long time, this is the way composers, and I would say still to this day, if we are using those practices of tonal harmony, composers or songwriters, I would say probably generally don't think, oh, I wonder what chord I should use here, and then, experiment around until they find the right one. Certainly some of them do, but most of them, either because they have studied it or because they have a good intuitive sense, have a particular function in mind, and that limits the choices of chord that you might choose, because certain chords will function in a certain way and others will not. In talking about tonal harmony in the last lecture, I also used the analogy of chess. And in that case, I said that in tonal music, that is music which is in a certain key, I said the king is like the tonic because it's the single most important tone, just like the king is the most important piece on the chessboard. And the other pieces exist kind of in relation to the king. Their function is to protect the king. Something sort of similar happens in tonal harmony when we talk about chords. The chord which is built on the tonic note, that is, if I'm in the key of C, C is the tonic note. That chord is the most important, and it has actually sort of like the most flexible function, sort of like the king in chess. It can move one place in any direction, one square in any direction. The other pieces have different functions, but the function of the king is pretty straightforward. Similarly, in tonal harmony, we have other chords built on other scale degrees in a piece of tonal music, but those other chords have perhaps a more limited function. They can do maybe 2 or 3 or 4 things well, but you cannot just use whatever chord you want, at least not if you want to have your sequence of chords, your progression, sound logical. Right. Now, again, I'm getting into music theory stuff here. I don't want to necessarily scare anyone off, but it's inevitable talking about harmony, talking about melody, that we're going to get into some music theory. And music theory is not really, it's not an exact science, it's not really a science at all. As I've defined it before, it's a process of trying to understand the materials of music, how they function, how they generate, let's say, an emotional response or something like meaning. But it's also kind of like a process of reverse engineering what composers have done. So composers, they are trained by their teachers and then they start to compose. But as they compose, they aren't necessarily thinking, well, I've got to conform to some theory. I have to obey some rule because that's what I was trained to do. Of course, composers are creative people, and creative people very often bend or break rules. And some composers have thrown out the rule book altogether and just sort of started all over again, created their own set of rules. So although music theory is very often taught in terms of rules, and we might think of it more as practices, that is, that music theorists examine the work of composers and try and reverse engineer from that. Here is what the composers tend to do, here are the practices, and then when we teach those to another generation of musicians, it's just kind of easier for us to teach it in terms of rules. So inevitably, though, when we do this, we maybe cause our students to misunderstand that what is really a creative process is just a bunch of rule following, and that's not true. It's maybe better to think of it as practices or conventions, but it's often taught in terms of rules. So one of these rules, at least in Western tonal music, has to do with consonance and dissonance. So that's the subject on the next page, page 41, consonance and dissonance. Consonance is simply is a word that describes a combination of different pitches that sounds stable or restful, that is, tones that blend well together. And if we look at that word, actually, and this is a good thing to do whenever learning a new word. You might have never heard the word consonance before. Con means together, like consolidate, confederate, right? Even the word concert, you might think that the word concert has something to do with music. Not necessarily. We might speak of doing something in concert with. Concert means just bringing together. The sonance in consonance, this S-O-N, is the root word for sound, like sonar, sonic, right? So consonance is a combination of tones that sounds like they blend well together and therefore sounds stable to us. It doesn't give us a feeling of agitation or tension. Dissonance is the opposite. We all know to diss somebody, to disrespect, or the D-I-S prefix is sort of it nullifies whatever comes afterwards. So dissonance are combinations of sounds that seem to clash and therefore create a feeling of tension. And the idea in tonal harmony was that dissonance is necessary. However, it should not be unresolved, that dissonances must resolve to consonances in the same way that tension should be followed by a release. And in the harmonic scheme of a piece of music, let's say within the chord progression that a composer might be coming up with, we will generally start out with consonants at the beginning of the piece of music, and we certainly need to end with consonants. We don't want to end with unresolved dissonances. But in between, we can have points of greater tension and of release, and this is brought about in large part by the sort of deployment of consonance and dissonance. We are going to talk quite a lot over the next several months about consonance and dissonance. So these are terms that you definitely want to remember, really along with all these other musical theory terms, because let's say when we get to the Baroque era a couple months from now and I start talking about unprepared dissonances, if you don't remember what a dissonance is in the first place, then it's going to be hard to understand that concept. I think this is a pretty easy concept to get, though, consonance and dissonance, and it's easy to demonstrate. So I got my little electric piano here, and I'm going to demonstrate some consonant and dissonant intervals for you. The most consonant interval, that is the simultaneous two different pitches, a combination that blends the best, is the octave. So there's an octave. And I've already talked about the significance of the octave, that it represents a 2-to-1 ratio. So the sound wave here is exactly half the frequency of this one. And it turns out that the simpler the ratio is, the more consonant the interval will be. Because remember, these intervals, they aren't really distances, they aren't spaces, they are differences in frequency. And if that difference in frequency corresponds to a simple ratio, like 2-to-1 or 3-to-2 or 4-to-3 or what have you, then we will tend to have a more consonant, a nice blending effect. When we have a dissonance, like for example, here's a dissonant interval, right? What we are really hearing is a more complex ratio that generates somehow this feeling in us that, you know, like a sound like this, we don't want to leave it hanging out there. We want it to either do something like this, we want it to resolve to a consonance. There are other ways that it could resolve to a consonance, like that. But we want these tense, unstable sounds to resolve to more peaceful, blending consonant sounds. Okay, so consonance and dissonance. The resolution, another term here, is when a dissonance is followed by a consonance. Right? By the way, the words consonance and dissonance are nouns, but we can easily turn them into adjectives by taking the CE at the end of the word and just putting a T there. So I could say that this interval, the octave, is a consonance, or I could say it is a consonant interval. I'm saying the same thing. So the octave represents a 2-to-1 ratio, and as you can hear, these tones blend together so well, it's actually hard for us to pick out the two different tones, this one here and that one up there. Right? The second most consonant interval is the interval of the perfect fifth. So for example, if I start on C, and if I count C as 1, and I go up 5 pitches from 1, I guess if we're counting 1, in the C major scale, like do, re, mi, fa, sol, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I get the interval of a perfect fifth. The perfect fifth is a 2-to-3 ratio. Another interval, now if I go from that, do, re, mi, fa, sol, if I go from this sol, la, ti, do, up to the higher C, right? That is, if I just invert that interval, instead of going from C up to G, if I go from G up to C, I get the interval of a perfect fourth, which is the next most consonant interval. It represents a 4-to-3 ratio, and so on and so forth. The next concept the book talks about is the triad. The triad is the most basic type of chord. Now, a triad does, as you might have guessed from the name, does have 3 different tones. However, it's not just any 3 tones. I can't just play any 3 tones on the piano and consider it a triad. A triad is a combination of 3 tones where the adjacent tones, the tones that are next to each other, let's say on the keyboard, are spaced at a distance of a third from each other. So for example, the C major triad, which is one particular type of triad built on one particular note, C, contains C, and if we consider C to be 1, we could say 1, 2, 3 in the C major scale. That gets us to E, C, D, E. And if I keep going and I go up again, similarly from the E, E, F, G, okay? The different tones within the triad, as a music theorist, we would say, well, the C is the root of the triad. It's sort of like the root of a tree. We could call it number 1, but we call it the root of the triad, and then 2, 3, we've got a third above that root, and then 3, 4, 5. Now this note is a third above the third, but it's a fifth. There's that interval of the perfect fifth. It's a fifth from the root. So we could say this triad has a root, a third, and a fifth. Or we could say that the triad is just 2/3 stacked on top of each other. We've got a lower third here and an upper third here, right? So we've got 2/3 stacked on top of each other, and on the outside we have the interval of a fifth. Right? Every triad has this. It's just that the size of the thirds and the size of the fifth on the outside is variable. So for example, the major triad happens to have a major third on the bottom, but a minor third on top. What if I reversed that or inverted that? What if I had a minor third on the bottom, but a major third on top? Then I would have a minor triad. These are the two most common types of triads, by the way, the major triad and the minor triad. Now, there are two other types, less commonly used, but still encountered, and that is, what if I were to have two minor thirds stacked on top of each other? Right, so here's a minor third, and then from that upper note, another minor third. In this case, I've got C, E flat, G flat. Now notice how what that gives me is, instead of a perfect fifth, which is what I had in the minor triad, this minor triad maybe sounds kind of sad or dramatic or gloomy or whatever, but at least it is stable. Like I can hear this combination of tones and I might think it sounds sort of serious or sad, but it's not terribly tense, right? This, however, is a tense chord. If I lower that fifth at the top, because my combination of thirds, they're both minor thirds now, so that means the distance to the fifth has been diminished. We call this a diminished triad. And it has a very tense kind of sound because the interval on the outside is diminished. For hundreds of years, this chord was treated very carefully by composers. You would never end a piece of music with this chord. And for a very long time, you wouldn't begin a piece of music with this chord either because it's too shocking, okay? It's too dissonant. This is the chord, by the way, that we hear, like, that we associate with, like, the cliffhanger ending, like, you know, like the girl tied to the railroad tracks in the silent movie, and the bad guy with the top hat and the mustache is rubbing his hands with glee as the train is rounding the corner. Tune in next week. Anyway, so that's the diminished triad, where we have two minor thirds stacked on top of each other. What if we had two major thirds stacked on top of each other? So from the same root, C, up a major third is E. So far it sounds like we might be making a major triad. There's our major triad. But what if we had, instead of major third and then minor third on top, what if we had a major third and another major third? This is the rarest type of triad. This is the augmented triad. And the augmented triad is an interesting chord because it is consonant, but it is unstable because it gives us a feeling of kind of like floating in space, like we're not rooted particularly. We're not sure what key we're in. So there are only 4 types of triads: major, minor, diminished, and augmented. Those are the only 4. But each one of those triads could be formed on any of the 12 different keys per octave. Remember, after we get into the next octave, we're just duplicating an octave up. So that means there are a total of 48 different possible triads. But remember, the triad is just the simplest type of chord used in Western music. There are more complex chords. There are what we call 7th chords. A seventh chord has not just a root, third, and fifth, like a triad. It also has the interval of a seventh above the root. So from our root, remember, it's like 1, the root is 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Right? Now, when we get to 8, we just get the octave, the duplication of the root, but at a higher octave. So it's not even really, in a way, it's not even considered a different pitch in a sense. This particular chord is what we call a major seventh chord because it's got a major triad and a major seventh. I could have instead a major triad with a minor seventh. Now this chord has a particular function. You can probably tell what it is, even though you might never have had any music theory. When we hear this chord, we have a feeling of expectation because there's some dissonance in there. The dissonance is that seventh on the outside. We expect it to do something like this. Right? That's how that chord functions, or has functioned for hundreds of years in tonal harmony. There are other possible functions, actually. I could take this chord and instead do this with it. And then maybe end up in a completely different place, tonally speaking. Anyway, we have triads and we have seventh chords. There are other types of seventh chords. For example, the minor seventh chord, a minor triad with a minor seventh. The diminished minor seventh chord, diminished triad with a minor seventh. And then there is the fully diminished seventh. That is a diminished triad with a diminished seventh. Right. Those are the 5 most common types of seventh chords. And again, I'm getting a little bit more in depth than I would expect to test you on. But I'm not just thinking about the test, I'm thinking of actually teaching you about music. So you would certainly need to know for the test that the triad is the most basic chord used in Western music. It contains 3 notes that are spaced at a distance of a third from each other. We could add more, we could stack more thirds on there and get 7th chords. We could get 9th chords. The interval of a 9th, that's like an octave plus a second. We can add 11ths and 13ths and get these very complex sounds. That's what gives jazz, for example, and it's not just jazz musicians who use these kinds of chords, but the distinctive sound of jazz is in part because it uses these types of chords in a different way than quote-unquote classical music does. Jazz actually doesn't use a lot of triads because triads, I guess, are considered sort of too plain vanilla for jazz. So in jazz music, although it is mostly tonal, there are some different practices, different rules, different expectations that are part of that style. Right? But it does use these same materials. It tends to use more complex chords that have more dissonance. Anytime you get beyond the triad, you are going to have dissonance in the chord. So for example, all of those 7th chords that I played, the major, the major minor, the minor minor, diminished minor, fully diminished, they all had some degree of dissonance in them. None of them were consonant chords. Right? Only the major and minor triads and the augmented triad is also a consonant chord. All of the others have some degree of dissonance in them. Now, we might think that, it's going back to consonance and dissonance for a moment, we might think that, well, dissonance seems like it's a bad thing, right? Because if we're harmonizing, we're creating harmony, we don't want to have tones that clash with each other. Actually, we do, because that's what generates tension. If we had only consonants all the time in our harmony, it would be too bland. It would be sort of like eating plain yogurt, not even vanilla yogurt, but unflavored plain yogurt. Or let's say eating food with no seasoning in it, right? We want to have some seasoning. The thing is, we don't want to have too much. We don't want to dump the entire container of cinnamon on our oatmeal. right? So it's a question of how much and how it's sort of deployed. But inevitably, it does mean that in Western tonal music, that is, music that is in a certain key, right, that uses these kind of practices or these rules that I'm talking about, there is more consonance than dissonance, right? Sort of like there is more oatmeal than cinnamon. What happened in the 20th century is that certain composers felt that this was wrong somehow, that why should there be more consonance than dissonance? Why not more dissonance than consonance? Why not no consonance at all? Now, these are interesting ideas in a sort of a theoretical sense, but the problem is audiences have grown up listening to music wherein the harmony is mostly consonant, occasionally dissonant, and the dissonance is there to generate tension, which can then be pleasantly resolved, right? If you have music that's dissonant all the time and the audience has a different expectation or has, let's say, grown up taking in sort of a different musical language, quote unquote, it's not really a language, but different expectation, different set of rules and practices, they're going to go into the concert hall and they're going to hear all of this dissonance and they're going to feel tense and they're not going to feel that release that they expect to feel when they go to a consonance, because there aren't these kinds of consonances in atonal music. So atonal music, I mean, it had a sort of a heyday in the early to mid 20th century, and there's still, you know, composers writing atonal music, but it didn't catch on very well with audiences. In fact, audiences tended to find atonal music not only jarring and maybe ugly, but just sort of like random. Like they couldn't tell the sound of the composition from the sound of the orchestra tuning up, you know, the random sounds of various musicians tuning up. Or, you know, for example, they thought that some atonal piano music sounded like a kitten running around on the keyboard, right? So harmony is as you can see, it's a very complex subject, and I'm always trying to, as I teach you this stuff, not get too far out ahead or too much in depth and run the risk of possibly confusing you. But again, I'm just kind of taking these terms out of the book and using them as sort of points of departure. The next couple of terms we have, they talk here about, they're starting to talk about the function. I've already talked about this a little bit. They talk about the tonic chord, the subdominant chord, the dominant chord. These terms, tonic, subdominant, dominant, refer to scale degrees. So remember what a scale is. What is a scale degree? It's a note within a scale. Let's take, for example, the major scale, which you might know by those syllables that we use, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Okay, there are 7 different tones until we get to the 8th tone, and that's really just a duplication at the octave up. So, for example, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, an octave up, and then we could keep going. So we really would say, well, there are 7 different tones in the major scale. It's just that we can keep going into higher octaves, and we would encounter keys that have the same name but are an octave higher, whose pitches are correspond to frequencies that are double what was in the octave below and all that. But each one of these scale degrees has a name. So scale degree 1 is the tonic. Already talked about that. Scale degree 2 is the supertonic. Not because it's better than the tonic, but because it's above. That's what super means. Scale degree 2 is above, quote unquote. Remember, it's not really above in space. It's just, you know. So it's supertonic. Scale degree 3 is called the mediant. And it's called the mediant because it's exactly in between the tonic and the second most important tone, the dominant. And notice there, if I have the tonic and the dominant and the mediant all together, I've got a major triad. I've got a tonic triad. In fact, I have the tonic, the triad that is built on the tonic on scale degree 1. Anyway, so we've got tonic, supertonic, mediant, subdominant. That's the note that's below the dominant. That's what sub means. Subdominant, dominant, submediant. And it's called the submediant because it's halfway between the tonic and the subdominant. And then we have the leading tone. Very important tone, the leading tone. The leading tone has this function of leading to the tonic. At a cadence, for example. Remember what a cadence is? It's sort of like a stopping point at the end of a phrase. Cadence is a term that can apply not just to melodies, but really to harmony. And the two are obviously related. So at the example, in the example I gave last time, of a cadence at the end of Happy Birthday, part of what makes that cadence work is the leading tone wanting to go to the tonic, right? Or here's another example. That at the end, that's leading tone going to tonic. The leading tone sort of has a function within the scale. It's pointing to the tonic and saying, here is the tonic. It has a lot of sort of built-in tendency to want to be followed by the tonic. And the reason is there's a half step in between. Not a whole step, but a half step. So when we get to this note, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, it's like we really want to go all the way up to do again, right? And composers take advantage of this as a way of sort of indicating what the tonic is. Music theory, again, I've talked about music theory a bit, and I worry about going a little bit overboard in music theory, but what's interesting about it to me is that it's a combination of sort of like math, right? Because we've got intervals, which are ratios, and we have formulas for making chords. So like, for example, you know, the major triad was a starting note, major third, and a minor third. And so there's a lot of numbers involved, but there's also a lot of psychology involved, because there are sort of expectations that a listener has, and those expectations are caused simply by his or her lifetime experience of listening to music and hearing harmony function in a certain way. When they hear a new piece of music, they expect some of those same functions to happen, right? And then the composer has said, well, I have to give them some of what they expect, but maybe I'm going to tweak their expectations a little bit as well and do some unexpected things. And again, there has to be a balance. We can't just, you know, like going to a movie, for example. There have to be some interesting plot twists. We can't just have everything be so predictable. But we can't have things be completely random and unpredictable either. Otherwise, people feel bewildered and confused, right? And that might have been part of the problem with atonal music, which we won't get to in this course, by the way, because we just won't have the time to make it all the way into the 20th century. We're going to stop in the 19th century because we're just going to run out of semester by then. Anyway, each of these chords, the tonic chord, the dominant chord, the subdominant chord, and the other chords which we could build on those other scale degrees, they all have certain functions. And here I'm getting sort of back to the beginning of this lecture. Chords tend to have functions, and therefore they are used in a logical sequence where, you know, if I'm starting off with a certain chord, I have to think about, well, what is its function? Meaning, what other chords can it lead to? And then I have to think, okay, this chord, can it be led to by that one? Will it work here? Will it function correctly? And then can I use this chord? You know, what are the other possible chords that I can go from there? So I've used the analogy of tools, the functions of tools. I've used the analogy of chess pieces. Another analogy to help understand this stuff is a composer in sort of plotting out his musical journey that he's going to take his audience on is sort of like a ship's captain or a navigator. And he has to know where the different, let's say, where the currents and the tides are, where the winds are, if we're talking about a sailing ship, where there are certain ports that he could stop or pause, you know, sort of points of navigation to help him on his journey. And so, especially when we get to the subject of modulation, which I'll get to very shortly, composers are sort of plotting a harmonic journey through different chords within a key, but then also from one key to another key to another key. That's what modulation is. When we start off in one key but change, let's say go from the key of G major to the key of C major to the key of A minor, right? That is a modulation, a change of key within a composition, which is different from a mere change of chord. I could go from one chord to another in a chord progression, but that chord progression could be staying within a given key. Or I could move from one key to another completely different key, and then from there to yet another different key. And these are like different regions on the map or on the globe, sort of within this musical world. Okay, but let's stick with the order that the book presents things in. I'm here at the bottom of page 41, and they talk about arpeggios. An arpeggio is simply a chord where instead of playing all the notes simultaneously, we play them one at a time, either going up or going down, right? The word arpeggio, by the way, is kind of an interesting word. It comes from the Italian word for harp, which is arpa. So a chord which is played in a harp-like way is an arpeggio. Okay. And we might see arpeggios in melody. So I talked about the Star-Spangled Banner last time. The Star-Spangled Banner, that initial opening phrase, is actually an arpeggio because it's outlining the notes of the tonic chord. Oh, say, can you see by? Right, that's an arpeggio that goes down and then goes back up, but it's just outlining the notes of the tonic chord. It doesn't even really matter what key we're in. Oh, say, can you see by? Oh, say, can you see by the dawn? Right? So, an arpeggio is simply a chord where the notes are played one at a time instead of all simultaneously. All right, turning the page, we see an example of a beautiful prelude by Frédéric Chopin, which they use to demonstrate principles of harmony. But you can I'll put that up on the listening tracks. You could just Google Chopin Prelude in E minor, and you'll find many, many wonderful performances of this piece on YouTube. Actually, the performance in this book is played by the author of the book, Roger Kamian. You can see that's the guy who wrote the book playing this piece by Frédéric Chopin. We won't get to Chopin until very close to the end of the semester. The greatest composer for the piano, Frédéric Chopin. Anyway, next thing that they talk about is key. And I've already talked about this, actually, because it's so difficult to talk about harmony starting from any one place. There are so many different aspects of it that it's hard to start from one place and not run into the problem of defining terms or using terms that you haven't defined yet. So all of this I've talked about. The concept of a keynote or the tonic. That's the note that I decide that a piece is going to be in. Talked about a scale. There are many different possible scales. It's just that the two that are used most commonly in Western music for the past, let's say, 500 years are the major scale and any one of the different forms of minor scale. There are actually 3 different forms of minor scale, but I'm not going to make you worry about that. And it says we can think of a scale as a series or set of pitches, usually separated by whole or half steps, but we can also think of it as an interval pattern. So if you were in my music theory class, you would all have to memorize the formula, the interval pattern of a major scale, which is simply start on any given note and go up a whole step a whole step, a half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. It's starting note, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And if you do that from any note, you will get a major scale. So I'm just going to pick a note at random. Okay. Starting note, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And it has that familiar sound of a major scale. Even though I was using almost completely different pitches than when I played this scale, they have that same kind of meaning or association, whatever it is. You recognize it as the same basic thing, but just transposed to a different pitch. By the way, this is something the book doesn't mention. Human beings are apparently the only animals that can recognize transposition. In other words, you and I can tell that this is essentially the same thing as this, but starting at a different pitch. We recognize that the interval pattern is the same. And even if you've never had any music theory, most of us can recognize that there is a sameness about those two things, right? Other animals cannot. From what I understand, no other animal, even birds, who have an incredible little brain in there, they can do, I mean, listen to a mockingbird sometime, the patterns it can come up with are amazing. Now, are the birds really thinking it though in terms of music, or is that basically their speech? That's another issue, but birds do not recognize transposition. To them, this is a completely different thing than this. And apparently that's even true of other primates, like gorillas don't recognize transposition. For example, you might know about the famous experiment of Pavlov and Pavlov's dogs. And most people know that, okay, Pavlov, this Russian scientist, would ring a bell and then feed a dog. Ring a bell, feed the dog. And he knows that if you ring the bell, the dog expects food and begins to salivate. But what most people don't know is that actually Pavlov was trying to figure out whether dogs, what was it that was making the dog salivate? Was it the sound of a bell, like any old random bell sound? Or was it the specific pitch of a certain bell, which means that if you used a different bell that had a different pitch, would the dog know the difference? Would the dog start to salivate because he's anticipating being fed? And it turns out that the dog will only salivate if it hears that bell. If we play a bell of a different pitch, it doesn't mean anything to the dog, right? Only that particular pitch. So that means that dogs have like pitch identification, what's known in for humans as perfect pitch. Certain musicians, for example, have perfect pitch, and certain musicians do not. Most human beings do not have what we call perfect pitch. That is, you can just play a note and instantly identify what note that is. Some people believe that as babies, we all have perfect pitch, but some of us maintain it and others lose it. I'm not sure what the current state of research on perfect pitch is, but I can tell you, for example, I do not have perfect pitch. I can figure out pitches. I have good relative pitch. I can recognize, major triads versus minor triads and different intervals with no problem. But if you just give me one pitch out of the blue, it takes me a while to figure out what it is, because what I have to do is actually I have to conjure up some music in my mind that I know is in a certain key, and then I compare the pitch that I heard to what I just conjured up in my mind, and then I can give it to you. Or occasionally I can, it just hits me and I can sort of guess it. But my wife, for example, has perfect pitch, and she recognizes pitch. Like if I just pick a note at random, she would recognize that that's A flat, just like you could recognize the color red or the color blue, right? Anyway, I'm getting a little off subject here, but human beings are the only animals that recognize transposition, which I think is kind of interesting. All right, so all this stuff about key, about the major scale and the minor scale, you don't need to know the interval pattern of a major scale or a minor scale. I'm not going to get that in depth, but you should know what a scale is. A scale is a series or a set of pitches. usually separated from each other by whole and half steps, which can form the basis of a musical composition. They do mention in here the chromatic scale. I kind of wish they hadn't, but they did, so let's talk about it. First of all, the word chromatic can be used in different contexts. The chroma part of that is actually the Greek word for color. A chromatic scale is a scale that has only half steps in it. Instead of a pattern of whole and half steps, sort of like we find in the major scale or the minor scale, the chromatic scale has only half steps, so it sounds like this. And you might imagine, I don't know, in a cartoon, like someone climbing a ladder, they're going up. The problem with the chromatic scale is, in tonal music, it's not really all that useful because we're not really sure what key we're in. We lose track of where we started. Because all of these intervals are half steps, none of the intervals is somehow more significant than the other. They're all the same, and therefore we kind of lose our orientation of where we are. Chromatic scale does have some use, but it mostly has a function of either sort of decoration, like embellishment, or filler in tonal music. It doesn't really have structural purpose in tonal music. What I wish they had done, if they were going to use the word chromatic, I wish instead of talking about the chromatic scale, I wish they had talked about the concept of diatonic versus chromatic. So I'm going to talk about this, and I'll probably wrap up the lecture with these definitions. These are important definitions that I may, in fact, put on the test. So, diatonic. This is a word not found in the book. Okay? Diatonic. D-I-A-T-O-N-I-C. Diatonic simply means staying within a given key or scale. Right? Diatonic means staying within a given key or scale. So, if I have a piece of music which does not ever use any of the pitches that are outside of the scale that I started out with. Let's say the C major scale. Now the C major scale is kind of handy because, as you may know, it uses only the white keys. It's the only major scale that uses only the white keys and no black keys. So it's good for demonstrating this concept. I could have a piece of music, or let's say a chord progression, that uses only those white keys, and then that chord progression would be strictly diatonic in the key of C. Like, here's an example. Oh, wait a minute. I had a chromatic tone in there. A tone that is not in the key. And I think you heard that, even though you're just learning these terms, diatonic and chromatic, you heard that something happened there. There was a little color, right, in that note in the bass line. Chromatic means using tones that are outside of the key. In other words, we've got a set of pitches, call us the scale, and I could use only those notes, and then my harmony would be diatonic, or I could say, you know, I want to take a note from outside of the scale and introduce it into my composition. If it's from outside of the scale, it's going to have a certain color. It's going to stand out more than the notes that are inside the scale. Therefore, we call those tones chromatic. And that's really, it's a more important concept than the chromatic scale. The chromatic scale, and this word chromatic, we're using it in two different contexts. The chromatic scale is a scale that has only half steps. Big deal. But the concept of diatonic versus chromatic is a more important concept. That is, are we limiting ourselves to only the tones within a given key or scale, or are we occasionally going outside of the key or scale, right, and introducing tones which, because they are outside of that set, they will stand out more to us. They will have a certain color. So again, now I'm not going to play My Country 'Tis of Thee. I don't know why I did that before. But let's say I have a chord progression. So far, strictly diatonic. I haven't played any black keys. You can see that I haven't touched a black key. Watch what happens when I touch one, though. You can hear some added color or tension is introduced. So I'm going to play, again, this chord progression. You can hear every time I touched a black key, there was some interesting color there. It sounded a little bit more complex. I was going in slightly unexpected directions, and you weren't really necessarily sure maybe where I was going to go with that. I wasn't even really sure because I was just making it up as I go along. That's the beauty of chromaticism. And this, in turn, well, we can actually almost kind of wrap up this unit, leads us to modulation. I already talked a little bit about modulation. That is when we shift from one key to another within a composition. And this is something that we may be a little bit less familiar with if we listen to only popular music because of the time limitation on popular music. Pop songs have to be like 3 or 4 minutes long, which means they may never have a chance to modulate because there's not enough time to start out in the home key, travel to some different key, and make it back to the home key in only 3 or 4 minutes. You might have a modulation or two in there, but in quote-unquote classical music, which there are some classical pieces that are really short like that, but then we have, let's say, a Beethoven symphony might be a half-hour long with several different movements or like different chapters of a book, and within each of those movements there will be many modulations. Beethoven wants to take his listeners on a journey. He doesn't want to just stay in the little home neighborhood, right? He's going to journey from one key to another, and then from there to another and another, in part because he has the time to do it. Like a single movement of a Beethoven symphony might be 10 minutes long, and there will be 4 of these movements. So you might have a symphony that's between, 30, 45 minutes long. So there are going to be lots of opportunities to modulate to different keys. And some of these keys are going to be sort of like closer to home, and some of them are more distant. So I'm going to do a couple of modulations for you, just very, very simple demonstrations. Here I am in the key of C again. Right? I'm going to play some diatonic chords in the key of C. This is like walking around the rooms of my own house, right? Not very exciting. Starting out in the hallway, to the living room, to the dining room, the kitchen, and back where I started. Okay, but now I'm going to modulate from the key of C to the key of, I'll go to the key of G, which is sort of like the key right next door. It's like my next door neighbor's house. So first I walk around in my own house a little bit, and then I modulate. I kind of like open the door to my neighbor's house, and then I walk around those same rooms in his house. What if I want to go back to my own house? There I go. I'm going to modulate again. Now I'm opening the door back to my own house. What if I want to go to the house on the other side? Like, if I want to go to the key of F major. Okay, I'm back in my own house walking around, right? And now, I lead into the key of F, just sort of like the next door neighbor on the other side. And from there, I can also, again, get back to my own house, back to C. So far, there's a couple of fairly uninteresting journeys, just going to the house next door. I could go to more distant places. I could modulate to some faraway, exotic location. Now, I might have to do that by a series of sort of like jumps from my home key to a closely related key to another closer until I get more and more distant. Or I could just sort of teleport myself there. There are certain modulations that are more dramatic because we are sort of instantly going to a faraway place, and these are sort of more unexpected. So for example, here's a modulation that is going to go in maybe an unexpected direction to a key that is farther away. Here I am in C, walking around the rooms of my own house, but now there I wound wound up in the key of B minor, which is not a closely related key, although C and B are next to each other on the keyboard. In terms of the sort of the compass or the map of tonality, C major and B minor are actually kind of far apart from each other. I could go even to more distant keys, like I could do something like this, and you'll hear that each time I do this, if I go to a more distant key, it sounds a little bit more out there somehow. There I went from C major to E major, which is, again, fairly distant, tonally speaking. So, modulation. That is the change of key within a composition from one key to another. One of the rules, though, even however many times we modulate, this is something that composers did. This really is kind of like a rule. If I start out in the key of C major and I modulate to a bunch of other keys, I have got to come back to the key of C major by the end of the composition. And this is a rule that composers followed really all the way up from the beginning of the tonal era, let's say the 1500s, and really even before that, but all the way up till, let's say, the late 1800s. Only then, after 400 years of following this rule, did some composers say, well, what if I were to end in a different key that I began in? All right, it's very unusual, very kind of radical move to make. Now, we may begin in one mode and end in a different mode. In other words, we do often hear something like beginning in C minor and ending in C major. We don't often hear the reverse. For example, starting off in a major mode but ending in a minor mode. That's possible. But generally, if composers start off in a minor mode, they will end in the major mode. That's different from a change of key, of course, because I would be still keeping the same key, like just changing mode from C minor to C major. For example, that's what Beethoven's Fifth Symphony does. Starts off in C minor, and it does end in the key of C, but it ends in C major. We'll get to Beethoven's Fifth in a couple of months. The next section of the book deals with texture, which I already talked about. Remember, I talked about texture in relation to melody. So what we're going to get to next lecture is musical form. So read up on musical form. We're coming to the end of this unit, actually. So you should be fairly well along. See you next time for a talk about musical form.